Good morning, this is Miss Brittany. So I'm here with you to do our lung demo lab. Unfortunately, you're at home, so we're going to do it a little bit different. First thing I want to start off with is this picture here. I'm not an artist, so no critiques, but there are a couple of things I wanted to show you. That the mouth and the nose both flow into the same location together, and eventually they flow into two different pathways. So there's one pathway that's in the front, and there's one pathway that's in the back. And so I wanted to tell you the difference of those two pathways. So first, the pathway in the front is going to be the ones that have that cartilage. You can feel it if you push on your throat right here. You feel the rings of cartilage. That's called the trachea. Usually, you guys call it the windpipe. But the trachea is the scientific word, so trachea. And that flows down and into each lung on either side. So the trachea goes down into your lungs. So that's your windpipe. The other side, in behind the trachea, is where food goes down into the stomach. And so where food goes down into the stomach, that's called the esophagus. So it's another tube, kind of like two straws, one in front and one in back. Food goes down the back and into your stomach. So a way to remember it is esophagus starts with an E. Eat starts with an E. So you're going to eat food down your esophagus. That kind of helps. And windpipe is for wind or air. That kind of helps. So there's the two things. Then there's a little flap. It goes in front of your trachea. It's upright and it folds down over the top of your trachea. The purpose of that little flap is so that when you swallow food, that it'll go all the way to the back, to the esophagus, instead of going into your lungs. You clearly don't want food in your lungs. You want it to go in your esophagus and into your stomach. So this little flap is called the epiglottis. So our epiglottis is a flap that protects us from food going into our lungs. We don't want food to go down the trachea. If you ever had choked on something, it's probably because your epiglottis didn't fold flat as you ate or drank. Maybe you were talking at the same time. So it opened up a little bit and let something into your lungs, and it makes it really hard to swallow that way. So your epiglottis is what's going to have this little flap right here to keep you from having food or water go down into your lungs. So we have the trachea or the windpipe. Trachea is for air. Esophagus is when you eat for food, and epiglottis is the little fat flap. And if you wanted to feel what the epiglottis feels like, if you put your fingers kind of where your chin and your throat meet together right in here, you can swallow with your mouth closed, and you'll feel this little bulge muscle pump push out right there. That's where your epiglottis is going down and back up when it's flexing and coming back. So that's your epiglottis. All right, so that's our first part. Now the second part is our demo, that we were going to be making a lung model. Well, unfortunately, we can't make the model in class because you're online. So here is an example. I brought Mr. Bones in to kind of show off what that looks like. So Mr. Bones has two balloons inside of his chest cavity here. These balloons represent your lungs. They're one on each side. And the chest cavity, this part right here, is the ribs on the outside. So a cavity means a hole. So in here is the chest cavity. That's where your lungs would be at. So chest cavity, this is your chest. It's a cavity because there's a hole or a space for your lungs to be in. Those are the two lungs. These are the ribs or the rib cage on either side. Okay, and so pretty easy terminology there. So now we're going to use him to see if we can figure out what these parts are. So if you were making this lab with me, it would have told you to use two balloons and a water bottle with the base cut off. So the base is cut off here. There's one balloon that's into the mouth right here. And then there's a half a balloon. I cut off the top of it, so just a half a balloon. And I'm going to put that over the bottom, hopefully without popping it. Perfect. Okay. So there's the bottom of the balloon. So now I have created a model of a lung. Hard to see a little bit, but take a look. So which part of this would we consider the lung in this whole thing? What would we consider the lung? Compare it to Mr. Bones. Obviously, the balloon in the center. So the balloon in the center right here, that's the lung. So if I was doing a really good model, I'd have 2 balloons in there. Can't really do that. But 1 balloon, so this is an example of 1 lung. So that's 1 balloon. Now the bottle, the outside of the bottle, what would the outside of the bottle be compared to Mr. Bones? The rib cage, right? The rib cage. This is the part, the hard plastic protects the lung, the balloon, and Mr. Bones has this hard ribs protecting his lungs. So same idea. Now there's this one part that's a little bit more confusing than the other, is this bottom red balloon. What is that? What is this bottom balloon? Well, I'm going to tell you a story to help you out with this bottom balloon. So my son was in an accident in June. He rolled his Jeep, and when he did, he collapsed his lung. So one of his lungs in here popped, or the space around it did, and he couldn't breathe. So the doctors had to give him oxygen and things like that to get him to breathe, and they had a tube sticking out of his lung. But the biggest question is, how come he couldn't breathe if he still has 1 good lung? So he still had 1 good lung, but this lung was not working right. So if you still have 1 lung and you can live with 1 lung, how come he couldn't? He could not get any air on his own. Well, here's why. There's a muscle that runs right here in your body, and it's called the diaphragm. It's kind of spelled weird. It has a G in it. It's spelled like a diaphragm, but it's diaphragm. The G is silent. And the diaphragm's job is to expand and contract to fill up your lungs. So for example, if Mr. Bones had a diaphragm, it would be right here, the bottom of his lungs. When he'd take a deep breath in, he'd breathe in, it would pull down and it would stretch these lungs out and air would go into the lungs. Then when he exhales, it would push these lungs back up here and push all the air out of his nose and mouth. Oh, broke his jaw. Don't mind him. So if this is my model, and this is the diaphragm down here, I'm going to show you what happens when he breathes in and breathes out. So we're going to start with, first, number 1 in Analyze. If you're doing your worksheet with me, under Analyze it says number 1, which parts of the model lung represent the lungs? So again, write down which part represents the lungs. That's the pink balloon. Which part is the chest cavity? That's the bottle. Which part, or actually everything inside the bottle. The rib cage is the outside of the bottle. And the diaphragm is this bottom piece down here. Now we go on to number 2. It says pull the diaphragm, this bottom balloon, down away from the lung. Watch the balloon inside the bottle. What do you observe? All right, so here we go. We're up close. I'm going to pull the diaphragm. Here we go. What just happened? I'm going to let it go. I'm going to pull the diaphragm. I'm going to let it go. One more time. Pull the diaphragm. What do you see happening? Every time I pull the diaphragm, this balloon is getting bigger. Okay? So when it asks you what do you observe, you're going to write down what you see happening right there. What do you see? Write that down. Then you're going on to number 3. Number 3 says, do you think pulling the diaphragm demonstrates inhaling or exhaling? Can't be both. So inhale means you breathe in. Exhale means you breathe out. So is pulling the diaphragm inhaling or exhaling? So let's watch. Are we inhaling or are we exhaling? Okay. So when we do it one more time, is this an inhale or an exhale? Think about it. When you inhale, your chest rises. When you exhale, your chest falls. Inhale, exhale. So what's happening? Is this an inhale or an exhale? You have to explain why. Why do you know it's inhaling or exhaling? So is the lung filling or is it deflating? Is it getting bigger or is it getting smaller? That's what you have to explain. Number 4, it says to push the diaphragm, the bottom part, up towards the lung and watch the balloon inside the bottle. What do you observe? Okay, so here we go. We're going to get in close. We're going to push the diaphragm in. Ready? Oh, what just happened? Try it again. So we're going to push it in. What did the balloon just do? You're going to write down what you just saw the balloon do. So one more time. I'm going to deflate. What did you just see the balloon do? So it asks you to write down what did you observe. That's what did you see happen. Then number 5. Do you think pushing the diaphragm demonstrates inhaling or exhaling? Not both. So let's try this again. If I push the diaphragm, is that inhaling or is that exhaling? One more time. Push the diaphragm. Is that inhaling or exhaling? Now you have to explain why. Why is it inhaling or why is it exhaling? What are you seeing that tells you it's inhaling? Or what are you seeing that tells you it's exhaling? And number 6, this is critical thinking. What do you think would happen if the chest cavity was punctured or a small hole was put in it? So small hole put in this space right here. Remember, like my son in that car accident, there was a puncture, there was a hole in his diaphragm, or actually in his chest cavity, not in his diaphragm. So from the side. So either way, whether it's the diaphragm or the chest cavity, it would be about the same. So if there's a hole here or here, let's see what happens. I'm going to make a little hole. Oops, that was more than a little hole. Hold on. Stand by. Okay. So I'm going to make a little hole. See, there's a little hole right there. So if I got stabbed or shot or whatever, and there's a hole there, or in a car accident, and there's a hole there, and I try to breathe, so my diaphragm tries to do its job, go down, back up. Exhale. Oh. Inhale, exhale. Oh, I broke it. Okay. Inhale and exhale. Is the balloon doing anything? Do you see the balloon doing anything? Do you see it inflating? Do you see it deflating? It's doing nothing, right? Because all it takes is one little hole. And the reason why is because your chest cavity is it's sealed. And if you've ever seen a plunger, like for a toilet plunger, a plunger works by pushing and pulling air and water into the toilet, right? To push things down. So it's kind of like a plunger. Or if you've seen one of those things that stick on a wall, those little things that hold things up on the wall, that they stick to something, and if you pull it off, it goes, and it pops off. So that's kind of what your diaphragm is doing. It's a plunger. It's pulling air into the lungs, pushing air out of the lungs. Your diaphragm is a muscle. Your lungs are not muscles. Your lungs are just empty bags. That's it. They're just an empty bag. They fill with air, and then they deflate. They fill with air, and they deflate. Your diaphragm is what brings the air into the lungs based on suction. If I put a hole in the side of this, can suction occur? Can air go in and out this little crack right here? Instead, if there's no suction because I have a hole in it, water, blood, whatever will come out that hole. So we have no suction working. The key idea is your lungs work off of suction. If your plunger has a hole in it, you're not going to get it to work. It's not going to do anything. So you can't have a hole in your chest cavity or in your diaphragm, or you'll end up not being able to breathe. Now, he survived his accident. Luckily, I know somebody's going to ask. He survived his accident because the doctors got in there and they were able to seal the hole in his side. They gave him oxygen and everything, and he healed up after a few weeks in the hospital. It took him to recover that lung, but his lung is still not totally healed. It's still going to take a little bit of time. But aside from that, he did recover. But if you didn't get to a hospital, if you didn't get any care, a collapsed lung could potentially kill you because you would run out of oxygen. Because even though you have 2 lungs, neither lung can work very well if there's no suction. They barely will work. You're riding on just a tiny bit of oxygen, so you'd probably be passing out. So no matter if you have 2 lungs, if you have a hole in the chest cavity at all, or in the diaphragm, you're probably not going to be breathing, or not breathing well for very long. So that's really important that you know that a hole in the chest cavity or in the diaphragm will result in very little breathing. See how my balloon's not inflating? Because there's no suction. All right. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you were able to learn something. Make sure you fill out your sheet either in class, if you had me in class, or fill out the Google Forms, which is the exact same thing, at home. You do not need to do both. So if you're at home doing distance learning completely, fill out the Google Forms, and if you're here with me at school, you'll do it at school. All right, guys, thank you very much.